Well, good morning, and thanks for getting up to join me. It feels like we're going fishing. Uh, it gets to be so dark in the morning. I feel like anyways, it's a good way to start the day because now when you're done with this, look at all the time you have to do so many other lovely things today. My goal for today, besides to have that discussion, was to also talk about the assignment that was submitted last night on Greta and Greg. And maybe we'll just start with, did you guys have any challenges with this assignment? Um, how do you think you did? Well, let's find out. I haven't started to grade it yet, but the final column was the trickiest. Yeah. Well, let's work through these because I think the practice will help. And one of the other things I think can be challenging when you're presented with a giant grid is it can be really overwhelming to see all of this information all at once and to keep it straight. I'm going to pull up the original document. One moment. And I'm encouraging you to pull up your submission and let's talk through any of them that you didn't get right. And if you want a second chance at it, and I'll give this to anybody who's online to explain where you got messed up and maybe what would be helpful for you in terms of like how will you remember that the next time, then I would be willing to give you some credit back. With this exercise should hopefully improve your results on the solo assignment that's due tonight. And we can also talk about any questions you have there. All right, so Greta and Greg. So here they are, they've bought a house together. And they paid how much for this house? Was it 100,000 originally? And Greta paid 25,000 and Greg paid 75. And because they're married, that in a couple of these scenarios, we don't really care how much each person brought. But do we care about it for tenancy in common? Does tenancy in common, and I should not abbreviate this, but that's a common. And just by the way, sometimes it's tenants in common, other times tenancy in common. It's the same thing. And with tenants in common, this whole difference in what they brought to the table, does it matter? Yes or no? Yeah, it does. And it's really interesting to work with clients who are aware of this and want to make damn sure that they keep this tenants in common title. I had this situation come up with a married couple who'd been married forever, like for 40 years. And she actually, it was her second marriage. She'd been married in the 60s for like 10 minutes. And I didn't know if she was divorced or if the guy passed away. I should be more sensitive, but she had a child with this person. And this child was now older than me. And, but my clients, the wife was very, very intent on keeping her accounts titled tenants in common with her husband of 40 years because she wanted her share, which was separate property, to go to her son Skip. And Skip is like a surgeon, but she was like, no, he's gonna get my share. And because she owned like 80% of this particular asset, whatever it was. And her husband, her current husband of 40 years, anyways, I said all that to say I couldn't believe how intense she was about this. I'm like, but it was important to her. And so you can, as a married couple, own lopsided amounts in a property if you use tenants in common. And so for this situation, as you know, Greg died in the house at the time of his death. Fair market value, 800,000 at the time of his death. And of course, his will says everything goes to Elise, right? His daughter, which is insane. Oh, I gave him a heart attack here. I thought it was a car accident. All right, Elise gets everything. So here we go. Tenants in common. The first question, how much is in his gross estate? Well, this depends on how much of it does he own. What is his ownership share at the time of his death? How much of this asset does he own? I'll take either a percentage or the amount in his gross estate. What do you think? Yeah, it's 75%. And so 75% of 800,000 is how much? What did you guys put down? Yeah. Now, does it go through probate? Does tenants in common have a right of survivorship feature, or do we need his will to tell us where to send it? Because that's what drives the dollar amount that's in this column or in this box. Needs the will, yeah. So if it needs the will, then it needs to go through probate. And so how much is in his, how much of this asset goes through his probate estate? I think you answered it. Yeah, 600,000. To my knowledge, there will never be a situation where the amount that goes through probate is different than the amount that goes through the gross estate, unless, of course, it doesn't go through probate at all. Any asset that's going through your probate estate is going to show up at whatever value it is in your gross estate. All right, so who gets Greg's share? I'm going to pick on somebody else. Nick. Elise, yes. Because Elise is his sole heir in his will. So now what's Greta's tax basis in the house? Because first of all, Greta didn't lose her ownership stake when Greg died, right? She still owns her 25% of the house. But what's her tax basis in the house after Greg's death? And again, this is not a community property state. What's her tax basis? Does her tax basis change when Greg dies? Does she get any benefit at all in her cost basis or tax basis upon his death? Well, Greta owns 25% of the house. She owns 25% of the house, so her fair market value ownership stake, yes, is 200,000, but her cost basis doesn't change. She still has that old cost basis from when she originally purchased the house of 25,000. So if Greta were to turn around and sell her share, because let's say she doesn't want to own a house with her daughter anymore, I don't know, it's sort of crazy, but so if she were to sell her $200,000 stake in the house, she'd have a gain of $175,000 because her cost basis would have stayed at 25,000. It's a little wonky because you probably know too much about the fact that on a personal residence, you don't really have capital gains problems until you actually have a much bigger gain than that. But all right, so what's Elise's tax basis in the house after Greg's death? How much did Elise inherit? What's the value of the asset that she received? Yeah, she received an asset valued at 600,000. And they both, I mean, these both indicate to us what her new tax basis is, because she got a step up. So if she were to sell her stake today to her mother, she would have no capital gains tax consequence because she got the step up. When you think about this whole step up in cost basis and what the rationale would be for it, from a tax standpoint, Greg owned this asset. He had his cost basis during his lifetime of $75,000 in his house. Its fair market value bounces around, bounces around, bounces around, and then he goes and dies, still owning this asset. And we push that asset through his gross estate where it shows up fully valued at 600,000. It's possible, unlikely, but possible that estate taxes will be owed on this $600,000 asset, depending upon what his other assets are worth. But we're just talking about a one asset estate here. And so since it shows up at that $600,000 level, we're not going to hose his recipient and say that, well, you've got to deal with, because this was an after-tax asset, his recipient will inherit it at that stepped up value of 600,000, and that will set the cost basis. That is not the case with any kind of assets that you would inherit that are considered, they're called IRD assets, and we'll talk more about those later, like IRAs. If any of you, has anybody ever inherited, an IRA asset from anybody? Pretty unlikely. It's possible you would have, but I have a lot of clients who inherit IRAs from their parents or from a grandparent. And, you have to pay taxes on that withdrawal as if it were regular income. So get ready for future chapters when we start messing with your mind about tax basis, but this one's simple. All right, any questions about tenants in common or tenancy in common or TIC? It's called all three. So if you submitted any of those with a different answer, keep track of where you messed up and explain where you got it messed up. And that'll help me teach it better the next time. One moment. Okay, so let's move on to tenancy by the entirety. First of all, who is tenancy by the entirety available to? Can you and your brother own a property tenancy by the entirety? Yes, spouses. And so in this case, the Greta and Greg were able to use tenancy by the entirety for the titling on this house. And so when you own something tenancy by the entirety, let's go back to this this lopsided ownership stake of or lopsided contribution, and talk about, do we care? Do we care that Greta and Greg brought different amounts to the table for tenancy by the entirety? What is the term that we use? This is a common test question. Well, it'll come up somehow. What's the term that we use when spouses bring lopsided amounts to the table, but we assume that they each own what percentage? It's sort of a two blanks there. We should play hangman. No, we won't play hangman. Another day we're going to play hangman, but it's first I'll tell you what what the rationale is, and you tell me what it's called. We assume when spouses buy a property together, no matter who brought what, that you are technically paying out of the same wallet. You're one economic unit. And so we're like, yeah, we're real proud of you that you brought all of the money to buy this house, but you were married when you did it. And so we assume you each brought what percent? First, give me the percent and then tell me what it's called. Yes. We assume you each brought 50%. And that concept starts with a D and ends with a D. Oh, that's funny. You're not seeing my screen. Hold on. Deemed. So you are deemed to have brought 50% to the table. And so with tenancy by the entirety, what percent does Greg own of that asset? Well, he owns 50%. And so what amount goes in his gross estate? When upon his death, what is the value that goes through his gross estate? Yes, 400,000. Because he owns half of it. Even though he paid for 75% of it, tenancy by the entirety is like, hey, we're in this together. And then how much goes through his probate estate? Right. Why is it 0, Ryan? Why is it 0? Or anybody that wants to help Ryan, why is it 0? Why is his probate estate 0? Exactly. You don't need the will to tell you where it goes, because where's it going? Exactly. It's going to Greta. Because he owns it with her. She's like, I don't care what the will says, Elise, it's mine. And so here's a tricky one. What's Greta's tax basis in the house after Greg's death? How would we figure this out? So her original stake was her original half, her cost basis. Again, we were back to deemed, right? It was deemed that she brought what percentage? 50. The thing cost 100. And so her half of the house that she technically owned before his death was at 50. And then she inherits his half at what cost basis? What's the cost basis for the half that she just inherited from her husband? Yes. And so now she owns the whole thing. And her new cost basis is 450. Because she keeps her half And then she gets his half. And now together, her new cost basis is a blend of her old cost basis and his. Again, it's not community property. Community property has its own weird deal. How many of you got that one right? If you know how to raise your hand, hit me. Way to go. Cool. Yes. Sweet. That one trips a lot of people up, so don't be surprised. And if you did get it wrong, I'll give you a second chance. I'll give you another version of it to work through. All right, so what's Elise's cost basis or tax basis in the house upon or after Greg's death? I love these because it's like not applicable. Because does she own anything? Nope, she does not. Okay, so let's get rid of these and let's move on. Any questions on those I should ask before I start erasing? Okay. Next up, community property. So actually, let me make sure I got that in the same order. Oh yeah, so they live in Wisconsin and they purchased the house with community funds. So what amount, if we're talking about community funds, will appear in Greg's gross estate? Under community property, we've got a $800,000 house. Oops. Where's my? Got an $800,000 house. Was purchased with community funds. We still have this deemed deal. So how much lands? Yes. In his gross estate, it is 400,000. Thank you. All right. And with community property, is there an automatic right of survivorship? Correct. So how much is in his probate estate? Exactly. We need probate to tell us where to go because it's this weird thing with community property. It's like, yeah, we're going to make sure everybody has their equal half and that you have your wealth and your spouse has their wealth and you can each independently decide where it's going to go. If you get divorced, we're going to split everything 50-50. That's community property. And upon your death, you're still a powerful economic owner. You can decide where to send that asset. It isn't necessarily going to go to your surviving spouse. You could totally give it to your surviving spouse in your will, but who did Greg direct his share to go to? So he gives his share to Elise. Bizarre. So now here's the mind blow, right? What happens to Greta's tax basis in the house after Greg's death? So again, Elise got his half, but Greta's tax basis in the house goes to what? So how much does she own? She owns half, right? And if they paid $100,000 for it, her original cost basis, because she's deemed, was $50,000. She wasn't even involved in this transaction upon his death. His half went to Elise. What is her tax basis in the house upon Greg's death? Yeah, it's 400,000. She got the spousal step up, which is one of the big benefits of community property. We could dig for the rationale for why that was offered, but it's pretty stunning that you get a step up in your cost basis, even if somebody else ended up with the, anyways, you get a step up, which is delightful. And then so Elisa's tax basis in the house. Oops, that is one bad square. What's Elisa's tax basis in the house? Whatever it went through the gross estate at. Again, because it's a taxable asset, not an income in respect to the decedent. One of those goofy rules. So everybody's got to step up. So if they sold that house, if Elise and Greta were like, let's sell this house that we now own together, and none of us will have a cost or a capital gain because we now hold this house with a cost basis of 800,000. If its fair market value is 800,000, we sell it today for zero gain. We can just move on. Okay. Questions about that one? And then last but not least, community property, but what was the deal? Separate funds, right? So they live in Wisconsin, a community property state, but Greg purchased the house with separate funds and titled the house sole owner. So this isn't that crazy. It could happen. Let's imagine that Greg just got a great big inheritance from his parents. And he's like, well, let's go back in time. Let's say that, because we've got to change these numbers, right? So when it comes to separate funds, and he paid 100,000 for the house with separate funds in a community property state, we'll be like, okay, smarty pants, fine, do what you want. You can go ahead and title it to yourself, even though you're still in a community property state. He titled it sole owner. Or sort of defeats pretty much everything about community property, right? It's that one weird little thing about separate funds. And separate funds could be, the source of separate funds could be prior to marriage, if you kept them separate, didn't commingle. So prior to marriage, or gifts during your lifetime, or maybe an inheritance. Those would be buckets of money that if you're careful, you can keep them separate. And so in a sole owner, even if it's a community property state, how much of that asset, its fair market value today, again, just as a reminder, is 800,000. How much of that asset is in his gross estate? What is the value of the asset that goes through his gross estate? How much of it does he own? What percentage of that asset does Greg own? Or did he own before he died? Yes, 100%. So 100% of that asset goes through lands in his gross estate. Does it go through probate? Do we need probate to tell us where to send it? Yeah, because sole owner has zero instruction associated with it. Unless, of course, 8-point font caveat, transfer on death deed or something clever like that. But he didn't have. We don't make any comment about that. And I will never test you on it, but I'm gonna keep drilling it into your head because it's one of the coolest things about being able to transfer property without needing it to be in probate. Anyway, so yes, it goes through his probate estate, and of course, it's going to go through probate. If it goes through probate, it's going to be in probate at the same price that it went through his gross estate. And then who gets his share? We know what his will says because his will still says everything to Elise. And if that's what his will said and it was a valid will, then it goes to Elise. So what is Greta's tax basis in the house after Greg's death? Exactly. Nothing. Not applicable because she owns nothing. We'll see if Elise lets her stay there. And then Elise's tax basis in the house after Greg's death? What will her cost basis or tax basis be? I use those terms interchangeably. I really think the appropriate term is cost basis, but so her cost basis in the house after Greg's death, Elise's, yes, 800,000, because that's kind of got washed through his gross estate at that amount. So that's what she's going to have for a new cost basis. Any questions on that one? This, by the way, was a test question that I used in, what year was this? 2018. The first test I ever gave to an estate planning class included that. Each of those is worth half a point. So if you missed any of them and you want a second shot at getting those points back, let me know. Hearing no questions about this, let's move on to any questions that you have about the assignment that's due tonight. And if you've already submitted it and decide you want to make a change to it, feel free. You can submit it second one. You still have time. And let me pull that up. Ned and Maud. So this one is going to lift off of much of what you've learned. Of course, we make it a little bit more awkward because now we've got two kids involved instead of just the one. And but pretty much if you understood everything about the Greta and Greg assignment, I believe you should be good to go with the Ned and Maud assignment. The contribution amounts are a little bit wonky, so you have to do some math, but otherwise, I think you should be comfortable with it. Is there always a spousal step up with community property? Yes. Yes, there is. So in a community property situation, you're going to get, even if you didn't inherit the other half, you get a step up in your own half. It's bizarre. I can't explain it. I really should dig in to find out what the rationale was behind that. It always helps me remember it better if I do that. I'm going to give you another minute to look over the Ned and Maud assignment, and I'm going to let you decide what of any of these ownership forms or the questions involved that you might want to discuss. Do you just split the tax basis in half for Rod and Todd? Yeah, I'll accept, if you just tell me, the tax basis divided by 2 for each of them. But yes, because they are, their own economic unit individually. So even though they're kids of the decedent, they each own their own personal share. And so, yeah, I just want you to make mention of the fact that you understand that, they each have their own stake in this asset, and that their cost basis is going to represent that half. Any other questions on this one that you would like to ask? Okay. Hearing none. I think next up, I was hoping to just do a little bit of an overview of the probate process. The lecture video, I'll let you watch on your own. I think it might be a little bit longer, but I've buried something in there for you to enjoy, which is there's a little section on celebrity probates. And anyways, hopefully it's makes it a little bit more interesting for you. This one, I won't play the whole thing. It's 39 minutes. And anyhow, so the probate process, I think, is not well understood by most people. They're like, it's very different in each state. But the general consensus among estate planning attorneys is that the probate process is not appealing. Like, it's something to be avoided. And it's to be avoided because it's not private, it's expensive, and or can be expensive. In Wisconsin, it's not terribly expensive to have some of your assets go through probate. But, there are some benefits to it as well, including making sure that your wishes are carried out in an orderly fashion. That's what probate court's goal is to make sure that your will is valid and that your wishes are carried out according to what you've documented in your will. And alternatively, if you don't have a valid will, then what do we look towards? If you don't have a will, then we need what to tell us where your assets go? Who's in charge of identifying where your assets go if you don't have a valid will? Exactly. State and testacy laws drive it, and every state is different. And I'm going to use the slides as a little bit of a guide to this discussion, but also bring up my drawings. Hold on a sec here. The a lot of the terms that we've already become accustomed to make a second appearance in this. And it's going to feel, I think, just a tish repetitive, which might be comforting for some of you. Others are going to be like, yawn, I'm so bored. I already know all of this. But I think the thing to reinforce here is that number one, who you pick as your executor to deal with the probate process for you, I hope they have their wits about them and that they are going to have good attention to detail and are relatively diplomatic. You've seen from the stories you've read in Beyond the Grave how people can behave. Perfectly lovely human beings can become pretty ugly in a hurry when money's involved. So the person who is sort of large and in charge, the executor, and as you've seen, you can name more than one person as executor. In the book, they make it sort of seem like that can be a good way to deal with it, but wow, I think can be a recipe for disaster too. Too many cooks in this decision kitchen. And keep in mind, whoever has this duty to be your executor or personal representative, depending upon the state, we call it a little bit something different. You that person has a fiduciary duty to the beneficiaries to like actually make sure that things are distributed according to the will. Sometimes they're scoundrels and they do not do what they're supposed to do. And in theory, they could be sued. I have a good friend right now whose mom just died. Her dad died a long time ago. And there's 3 kids that should be inheriting this pretty modest estate. And the sister who is acting as executor has made at least 3 decisions that are clearly a breach of her fiduciary duty. Nobody's going to sue her over it because it's just not worth it. The estate's not big enough, but technically they could. So they do have a fiduciary duty, but you still want to pick somebody who you trust to manage your affairs fairly and to be decent human beings about it. The cost involved with probate is really up to the state. It's typically a percentage of the assets that go through probate drive that cost. For most people, their largest asset is going to be their home. And so if your home goes through probate, that would be a good one maybe to try to find a different way to get that asset to pass. Otherwise, the rest of your assets might, who knows? It depends on the individual. But there's a way to get a lot of things out of probate, things that you might have clients that have their assets titled in a way that they're going to have a big amount go through probate. And there are some clever things that you can do to avoid it. I'm going to see if I can share this. One moment. And this is just a quick example of how you could, with your work that you might do with clients someday, help them rearrange their assets so that they wouldn't have to go through probate. In the top, let's say your client Jane shows up to your office with these assets. She owns a bank account, an IRA, some jewelry, life insurance, cabin, and her poems that she's written. And the way that she has her assets titled, everything's going to go through probate. Her bank account is titled to her only with no payable on death form on file. I made everything worth 10 grand. She's got an IRA, which is in her name only, of course, because all IRAs are in your name only. And she has as her beneficiary designation, because with IRAs, you have a beneficiary designation. She said put to her estate. She's a single person. She wasn't thinking about who she wanted it to go to. And she thought it would just be easier to have it go to her estate. So that's, of course, going to go through probate. Jewelry doesn't have a title. So it's just sort of, at least her jewelry didn't have a title. So, of course, we need her will to speak to that. And with life insurance, again, we have a beneficiary designation to my estate. So that's going to go through probate. Her cabin is titled to her only with no transfer on death deed on file. And then her poems, no title. and no beneficiary. So her gross estate value at 60,000 is the same as her probate estate value. So what could you do to help her? She comes to you and she's like, I do not want my assets to go through probate. What clever maneuvers can you help me with to reduce the assets that go through probate? And your options include, for her bank account, doing a payable on death deed. So you go to it's a form. She goes to her bank. She's like, I want to fill out a payable on death form. She fills it out and it's to her niece or whoever she wants it to go to. So now, does her niece have any ownership stake in this account while Jane's alive? With a payable on death form, does her niece have any ownership stake in this bank account while Jane is alive? Yes or no? Correct, it's no. That payable on death form is essentially a beneficiary designation. She could have, like, look at, she's got as her estate as her beneficiary to her IRA right now. She's got her estate as her beneficiary to her life insurance. She could say her neighbor, Jed, is going to be her beneficiary. And the minute he upsets her by putting a fence too close to the property line, she's like, forget you, Jed, I'm going to pick my niece. And so she can change things. So the fact that you can change your beneficiary designation so easily should tell you that that person never had any ownership stake. They were like, please let her not change her mind. And if she changes her mind, then that's it. So the only beneficiary designation that matters is the one that's in place at the time of her death. So to her bank account, again, this payable on death acts like a beneficiary designation. She could change it anytime. Her IRA, same thing. She wants that to go to a charity. Well, then let's have it go to a charity. She can name the charity as a beneficiary, and so it will avoid probate and go directly to the United Way. Her jewelry doesn't have a title. And so unless we give it away during her lifetime or find a way to title it, we're sort of stuck with it being in probate. We don't really have a choice. So if she doesn't want the jewelry now, give it away. Give it away before you die. That's how you're going to be sure that it avoids probate. Life insurance, we can name a beneficiary. Cabin, we can do a transfer on death deed if we wanted to, if it's available in your state. And poems, same thing. We can't really do anything. Let's say they actually, or, she could sell them. They're decent poems. She could, technically, she could give away the rights during her lifetime. But again, without a title, it's very difficult for us to make sure upon her death that they go through anything other than probate. So, oops. Anyhow, any questions on how to help move assets outside of probate? Okay. So the rest of this chapter really focuses heavily on some of the challenges with leaving your estate to the people who you want if you're going to use your will to accomplish it. We spend a lot of time talking about non-traditional relationships and all of the disasters that can happen. When I first started financial planning, my one area of focus that was important to me was to identify all of the potential pitfalls for same-sex couples or unmarried couples that they needed to be aware of in terms of where they could find themselves in trouble if they lost each other or if either of them became incapacitated, because there are special planning considerations in those relationships that most people just don't think about. And so this chapter spends a lot of time, especially with non-traditional relationships, making the point that if you have someone in your life that you want to make sure receives a piece of property upon your death, and you're afraid that it's going to be a little bit controversial, you probably don't want your will to be the source of the giving. You don't want your probate estate and your will to be driving that bequest. you'd be better off using a beneficiary designation or giving it away during your lifetime. Um, Otherwise, I think there's some drama and interest in the probate process. I'll let you listen to the lecture on your own, and we'll continue the discussion next week. Anybody have anything else that they want to talk about today? If not, I hope you have an awesome Thursday. I'll be sending out an announcement regarding class next week. But I'll hang out for a few minutes to take any questions that you guys have.